Last week, I celebrated my 35th birthday, but birthdays lost their charm a while ago. It's not just the age, it's also the chronic illness that emerges at the most inconvenient moments. This year followed the same script. The day after my muted celebration, consisting solely of takeout pizza and solitude, I found myself heading to the clinic for a checkup and some pain management therapy. The clinic had become a familiar place, offering both solace and a somber reminder of reality. Its white walls, the pervasive scent of disinfectant, and the overly hopeful expressions worn by faces I'd come to recognize marked it as a place of routine visits. Waiting for my appointment, I spotted Brian, the exceptionally charming nurse who'd intermittently been part of my treatment team over the past year. With his dark hair, warm smile, and empathetic eyes, Brian had a way of making you feel genuinely cared for. "Deborah, I didn't expect you here so soon. Everything okay?" he asked, approaching me with a concern that resonated in his voice. "Just the usual tune-up," I responded, trying to mask the nervous excitement his presence induced. Brian's laugh lightened the mood. "Well, let's get you checked in. I'll be taking care of you today." His phrasing lingered in the air, hinting at meanings my heart fluttered to consider. As we moved toward the examination room, I noticed other patients glancing at him, clearly drawn by his allure. Brian took my vitals with professionalism and gentleness. "Blood pressure's a bit high. Stressed about something?" he queried. "You could say that," I replied, my gaze drifting off as I pondered the complexities of life. "Tell me about it," Brian responded, jotting down notes before continuing. "You need to relax more, Deborah. You push yourself too hard." "That's easy for you to say," I snapped back, more sharply than intended. Brian paused, his steady gaze meeting mine. "I know it's tough. You're always here, always battling. When do you get time for yourself? For something more, for someone's?" His directness caught me off guard. "What are you suggesting, Brian?" I asked, the intensity of the moment palpable. He took a moment before replying. "I see you, Deborah. Not just as the patient, or the woman always fighting a battle. I see you, and I like what I see." The closeness suddenly felt overwhelming. Despite my reservations about my condition, Brian's words broke through my defenses. "Brian, I'm not sure I can. I don't care about the condition," he interrupted, his voice firm yet caring. "I care about you, the real you beyond the medical charts and doctor visits." It was a lot to process at once. A part of me wanted to flee, but another, long-silenced part, wondered about the possibility of letting someone into my guarded world. Since that conversation, Brian and I gradually began to spend more time together outside the clinical environment. It wasn't just about medical appointments anymore. It was about dinners, movies, and long drives, activities I hadn't allowed myself to enjoy for a long time. Brian made them simple, enjoyable, and exciting. He brought a new perspective to even the simplest things like a walk in the park. About 7 months later, after that pivotal talk in the clinic, our relationship had blossomed into something beautiful and supportive, showing me how to embrace life's moments despite the challenges. We were lounging on my couch, savoring some budget-friendly takeout after a hectic week. I was still chuckling from a joke he'd made, my laughter echoing around the room when his demeanor shifted dramatically. The laughter still lingering in the air, I noticed his expression turn serious. "Deborah, there's something I need to ask you," Brian said, his tone shifting from jovial to intense, causing my laughter to catch in my throat. He paused, taking a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and produced a small box. My heart raced at the sight. "These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. I know this seems quick and maybe a bit crazy, but I don't want to wait any longer. Deborah, will you marry me?" His voice held a mix of determination and a hint of nerves. I was speechless for a moment, my eyes flicking from the ring to his earnest face. "Brian, I don't know what to say." "Yes," I finally managed, my voice a whisper. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding, his famous lopsided grin breaking across his face. I took the box from him, the ring simple yet stunning. Understated but perfect for us. "Brian, I do love you. I really do. But if we're doing this, it's going to be on my terms," I declared. "Anything," He responded immediately, his face open and expectant. "I want a prenup," I stated bluntly. His expression remained unchanged. No surprise, no disappointment, just readiness. "If something happens to me, everything goes to you. But if we split, I don't want there to be any issues." "Sure," Brian interrupted. "I don't care about that. I don't want your stuff, Deborah. I just want you." That was when I knew my answer for certain. "All right then, yes. I'll marry you." The joy that illuminated his face was like dawn breaking after a long, dark night. He slid the ring onto my finger, and our kiss sealed our whirlwind but utterly heartfelt engagement. We didn't hesitate long. The wedding was set for just a few weeks later, an intimate ceremony at the city hall with just him, me, his sister, and her husband. It was an unconventional wedding. No lavish gown, no throngs of guests, just the essentials. Yet it felt perfectly right with Brian. We exchanged rings, signed the papers, and it was official. We were married. As we stepped out of the city hall, his sister tossed confetti into the air, her laughter mingling with shouts of congratulations. Life with Brian initially felt like a fairy tale, or my version of one at least. He left his nursing job, tired of the emotional drain of caring for others day in and day out. With the restaurant doing well, it was nice having him around more. For the first few months, Brian was the ideal husband out of a classic romance novel. He cooked meals that would make any chef envious and kept our home immaculate. Dinners were extravagant affairs with candles and background music that made me feel like royalty. But slowly, things began to change. It started almost imperceptibly. I'd come home to find him secluded in his office, the space he'd claimed for himself right after our wedding, supposedly to manage household tasks like bills. "Dinner in 22?" he'd shout, without coming out to greet me. One evening, frazzled from a tough day at the restaurant, where nothing had gone right, I returned home to this new routine that was quietly unsettling. After a particularly challenging day at the restaurant, where a waitress had abruptly quit mid-shift, my nerves were frayed. I was in no mood for small talk or delays. I walked into my home expecting the usual, dinner prepared and the table set, the comforting routine we had established. But the house greeted me with an unsettling silence. Brian was nowhere to be seen, not even in his usual haunt, his office. I ventured into the kitchen, where I found a note stuck to the fridge, ordered pizza. Too beat to cook. Upstairs, the message was devoid of any warmth, no loving sign-off, not even a "see you soon." Disappointment washed over me as I tossed my bag onto the counter, my frustration growing. When the pizza arrived, I ate it there and then, cold and alone in the silence of a kitchen. A couple of days later, I decided it was time to address the growing distance between us. I found Brian in his office, the door slightly open. I knocked and pushed the door wider. He was absorbed in something on his computer and didn't turn to face me. "Hey, can we talk?" I asked, leaning on the door frame. "Sure. What's up?" he replied, eyes still glued to the screen. "It's about the other night and actually the past few weeks. You've been distant. Is everything all right?" I inquired, stepping into the room. He minimized his screen and finally looked at me. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just got a lot on my mind, you know? House stuff, bills, that kind of thing." It sounded like a brushed-off excuse. "Brian, you know you can talk to me, right? If something's bothering you." He cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. I said it's nothing. Don't worry about it. But worry I did. It wasn't like him to shut me out. That night, dinner was a quiet affair. He had cooked, but the effort was minimal. No candles, no music, just silence. Driven by a hunch, I came home early one day, earlier than usual given the usual chaos at the restaurant. As I entered, I was surprised by the sound of bustling in the kitchen. I found a middle-aged woman humming as she chopped vegetables. "Who are you?" I blurted out, unable to mask my shock. The woman turned, slightly startled, then smiled. "Oh, hello. You must be Mrs. Deborah Miller. I'm Sarah. I've been helping out around here for about a year now, cooking, cleaning, all the housework. Brian hired me. He said it was too much for him to manage." Too much for him to manage? That was news to me. "Right, I see. Well, Keep doing what you're doing, Sarah. I need to sort something out, I said, my mind racing with questions about where Brian had been spending his time if not at home managing things as he claimed. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I stepped outside and dialed the number of a detective agency I had heard about. It was time to uncover what my husband was really up to. A few days later, the detective returned with surprising news. Although part of me felt relieved to learn there was no other woman, the real issue was just as troubling. Brian had been frequenting casinos, accumulating debts as though they were going out of style. That evening, when Brian came home, I was waiting for him, the detective's report in hand. His face fell as he noticed the serious look on mine. "Deborah, what's wrong?" he asked, his keys clattering on the table as he tried to gauge my mood. "Brian, where has our money been going?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. Brian's eyes shifted away, his discomfort visible. "What do you mean?" "Gambling, Brian. Casinos, debts. Does that ring any bells?" I waved the detective's report in front of him. He collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "I was going to tell you. I just needed to sort it out first," he murmured. "By gambling more?" My patience was thinning rapidly. "It's not like that," he protested weakly. "It started small. I thought I could win back what I'd lost, but..." His voice trailed off, his expression miserable. I took a deep breath. This was not the life I envisioned with him. "Brian, you need professional help. And you're going to get it, or we're done," I declared, gesturing to signify the potential end of us. He looked up, tears glossing his eyes. "I'll do anything, Deborah. Please just help me this one time. I promise I'll stop. I'll get treatment."
"Fine.
"But this is your only chance. You're signing a receipt for every penny I spend to clear these debts, and you're starting treatment," I stated resolutely. The next few weeks were a blur. I paid off the debts, which amounted to $200,000. Brian signed every receipt and began his treatment. It was hard watching him struggle, but a part of me felt hopeful that we were finally moving past this nightmare. Months passed, and Brian's recovery seemed on track. We had settled into a new routine, which felt almost normal until one evening. We were sitting on the couch, watching a forgettable TV show when Brian turned to me with a serious expression. "Deborah, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we thought about having a kid," he said cautiously, trying to gauge my reaction. A cold knot formed in my stomach. We had discussed this long before getting married, and he knew my medical situation. "Brian, you know I can't. The doctors have always been clear about the risks. Pregnancy could kill me. My body wouldn't handle it," I reminded him. He nodded, but his nod seemed almost relieved, which didn't sit right with me. I pushed the thought aside as he continued. "We need an heir, Deborah. Someone to carry on after us." I laughed, more harshly than I intended. "This isn't the medieval times, Brian. It's just us, and my restaurant isn't a kingdom." But he persisted over the next few days, each conversation more forceful than the last. One afternoon, I received a call from his sister Megan, who was an obstetrician at the clinic where I sometimes received treatment. "Deborah, Brian tells me you're hesitant about having a child. You should reconsider. With today's medical advancements, it's perfectly safe," she advised. "Megan, you've seen my medical files. You know safe is a relative term for someone like me," I replied, my frustration building as I stood in the middle of my kitchen, my phone pressed tightly against my ear. "Sometimes you just have to think about more than just yourself." "You're just being selfish," she retorted sharply. "Selfish? Really? It's my life we're talking about." "My health," I snapped, my voice rising. The phone shook in my hand. She didn't apologize. Instead, she hung up, leaving a bitter silence hanging in the air. When Brian came home that evening, he found me still visibly upset. "What's got you all worked up?" he asked, dropping his keys on the table. "Your sister called. She's got opinions about us having a baby," I said, not meeting his eyes as I stirred the pot on the stove more vigorously than necessary. I remember that day distinctly. It was bright and clear, yet a biting chill in the air hinted at something amiss. I arrived home earlier than usual, only to find the scene in my apartment unsettlingly chaotic. There, in my living room, stood Brian, his sister Megan, her husband Gregory, and a collection of boxes. "Deborah, good, you're here," Megan announced in a tone that was both firm and cold, as though she was delivering a business report. "We're moving in. This is Brian's apartment, and you need to leave." I was dumbfounded. "What are you talking about, Megan?" "This is my home," I responded, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to process the shock. Brian stepped forward, his expression more severe than I had ever seen. "Deborah, I can't do this anymore. You've been controlling and demeaning for years. I've had enough," he declared. His accusation stung like a slap. "Controlling? Demeaning? Brian, what are you talking about? It's always been about what you want, what you need. I've been nothing but a servant here," he continued, his voice escalating with every word. "Cooking, cleaning, taking care of you, and in return I get nothing but insults." Megan joined in, her voice just as accusatory. "We've seen it, Gregory and I. How you treat him. It's time Brian stood up for himself." Brian then shoved a stack of papers toward me, his eyes alight with a mix of anger and what seemed like triumph. "I've filed for divorce, Deborah, and I'm seeking compensation for years of emotional labor and abuse. You'll hear from my lawyer." Instead of the outrage they likely expected, a cold calm washed over me. I scanned the apartment, my gaze lingering on Brian and his apparent co-conspirators, realizing there was nothing left for me here. "All right, Brian. You'll hear from my lawyer too," I said evenly. Without another word, I retreated to our bedroom. No, my bedroom now, and began to pack a suitcase. Within an hour, I was in my car, driving away from the apartment, from the deceit and betrayal of people I once trusted. I headed to a place I had always known would be my refuge if my world ever crumbled, a luxurious house in an elite cottage village, complete with a specialized clinic nearby. This house, purchased with the foresight of needing immediate and intensive care, represented my true safe haven. As I passed through the gates of the village, the security guards nodded in recognition, a small comfort on a day rife with upheaval. Inside my house, I wandered through the spacious, sunlit rooms, each corner meticulously curated over the years to provide comfort and care, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated home I had just left. I settled onto the plush sofa, chosen specifically for days when my body demanded rest. Lying there, I couldn't help but feel a twisted gratitude towards Brian for revealing his true colors before it was too late. I had prepared for a life of possible solitude from the beginning, and it was this foresight that now comforted me, allowing me to embrace the tranquility of my new sanctuary, undisturbed yet reflective. A few days after settling into my sanctuary, I received a frantic call from Brian. His voice was a blend of panic and fury. "You framed me, Deborah. This is all some sick game to you, isn't it?" he accused as soon as I answered. I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of his claim. "Brian, if there's something you want to discuss, come over." "I'm not playing games, but we can talk," I replied, sending him my new address, my tone calm and stark against his tempest. When Brian, Megan, and her husband Gregory arrived, the guards let them through. From my front porch, I watched them step out of their car, their expressions a mix of shock and awe at the size and grandeur of my home, as if they had stepped into a realm far beyond their expectations. Brian, gathering himself, confronted me. "Your lawyer called. He said I have to pay rent for the apartment, $5,000 next month because you sold it years ago. You planned this all along." I leaned against the door frame, finding his agitation more tiresome than alarming. "Brian, that apartment was a rental property under a company I own. You assumed it was mine to live in, not to own," I explained calmly. He sputtered, frustration evident on his face. "But I put time into that place, cared for it. I deserve compensation, and if you don't give me this house, I'll take you to court." Megan, ever the supporter, piped up, her voice shrill. "And why not? Look at it, Brian. She owes us. Living in luxury while we get nothing but scraps." I laughed, not out of amusement, but because of their sheer audacity. "I bought this house long before I met you, Brian. It's legally untouchable by you or anyone else. Megan was seething, her husband tugging at her arm, trying to coax her back to the car. "This isn't over, Deborah. We'll get what's ours," she hissed. I sighed, motioning to the security guards who had been observing from a distance. "I think it's time for you to leave." As they escorted Brian and his entourage out, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that I had the foresight to protect myself, and sorrow for the man I thought I knew and had married. The courtroom scene that followed was tense. The room was packed with curious onlookers and filled with the sharp scent of tension. I sat straight, my hands folded neatly on my lap, as Brian and his lawyer prepared their misguided portrayal of victimhood. "Your Honor, my client has been systematically exploited and emotionally abused by the defendant, forced to endure years of servitude, cooking, cleaning, and subjected to relentless emotional degradation," Brian's lawyer proclaimed, his voice booming across the room. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood, commanding the attention of everyone present. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is not a case of exploitation, but rather a calculated attempt to extort my client, a successful businesswoman. We have substantial evidence to prove that Mr. Brian has not only lied about his contributions, but has also deceived my client regarding his activities during their marriage." She then called Sarah, the actual housekeeper who had been doing all the work Brian claimed as his own. Sarah approached the stand, her demeanor calm and honest. "Please tell the court about your employment," my lawyer requested. "I was hired by Mr. Brian Miller to handle all household duties, cleaning, cooking, everything he's claimed to have done himself. I was paid from a separate account which Mr. Miller managed," Sarah testified, her voice steady, revealing the truth behind Brian's claims. Sarah's testimony continued to resonate through the courtroom. "How often did Mrs. Deborah Miller interact with you in terms of household management?" asked my lawyer. "Never," Sarah replied firmly. She was under the impression that her husband was managing everything, as he claimed. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as the reality of Brian's deceit began to unfold. My lawyer then presented the prenuptial agreement, outlining the terms of our marriage and the financial arrangements in case of a divorce. As you can see, the prenup clearly states that in the event of a divorce initiated under such false pretenses, Mr. Brian Miller is entitled to nothing, my lawyer concluded, her tone unwavering. Brian's face went ashen, perhaps realizing at that moment he hadn't fully understood the prenup he had signed. His lawyer fumbled with his notes, his case falling apart before everyone's eyes. The judge reviewed the documents, his expression inscrutable. Then, with decisive finality, he announced, "I find in favor of Mrs. Deborah Miller. The claims against her are unfounded, and the prenuptial agreement stands as valid. The divorce is granted, with no financial compensation to Mr. Brian Miller." Brian slumped back in his seat, utterly defeated. Outside the courthouse, his sister's fury was palpable. "You fool! You couldn't even do this, right? We could have had it all if you'd just convinced her to agree to have a child," she berated him. Days later, Brian appeared at the gates of my elite village, desperation clear on his face. "Deborah, please, I'll do anything. Clean, cook. Just let me come back," he pleaded, his voice cracking with despair. I felt nothing but disgust seeing the man I once loved reduced to this state. "Brian, you need to leave now. You're not welcome here," I said firmly. The security guards promptly escorted him out. I watched as he was led away, then blocked his number and all other forms of contact. This chapter of my life was definitively closed. I turned back toward my home, feeling a profound sense of relief and freedom. My life was once again my own, and I was determined to live it to the fullest, unencumbered by the shadows of the past. The tranquility of my sanctuary awaited, a testament to my resilience and foresight. It was time to move forward, embracing the peace and opportunities of my new beginning.